Hi students, welcome to SPSVERSITY. Today we are going to discuss about breathing and exchange of gases. So what is this breathing and what is meant by exchange of gases? So breathing means taking in of oxygen and releasing of carbon dioxide. To take in oxygen and release of carbon dioxide, so we require a respiratory system, so which is important for taking in oxygen and releasing out of carbon dioxide. Okay. So depending upon the species, the respiratory system will be differing. Like if we take humans, in humans the respiratory organs are lungs. Okay. Like in earthworm, it is skin itself is a respiratory organ. In cockroach-like organisms, trachea is the respiratory organ. Okay. So here when you come to human respiratory system, so here air enters into the respiratory system through nasal cavity. Later on it passes through pharynx, larynx and next to trachea. The trachea will divide into two branches, they are called bronchi. And each bronchi divides into numerous branches, they are called bronchioles, which enter into the lungs. So here if you see the diagram very carefully, it starts with nasal cavity. The next part, pharynx. The next is larynx. The windpipe, trachea. Okay. Trachea in thoracic region, it divides into two branches. They are called bronchus. Again, after entering into lungs, they will divide into branches. They are called bronchioles. And each bronchiole, that is the terminal bronchiole, will end with a sac-like structure. So that sac-like structure is alveoli. So that sac-like structure is called alveoli. So here the blood vessel which is carrying oxygen-rich blood, okay, that is through pulmonary vein, and which is oxygen pure blood, that is deoxygenated blood. Oxygen pure blood means it is deoxygenated blood, so which is carried by pulmonary artery. So every bronchiole ends with an alveoli, where the exchange of gases takes place. So the remaining entire pathway is, it is just a pathway for movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide. But whereas in alveoli we can see exchange of gases. Okay. So only in nasal cavity, so the hairs which are present in nasal cavity will filter the air. Okay. Will filter dust particles. The mucus which is secreted will trap the microorganisms. So will trap the microorganisms. And next, the humidification of the air takes place inside nasal cavity. So where it is brought to the body's temperature. So the air which is entering into nasal cavity, it has to be brought to normal temperature. Besides this, all are the respiratory tract. Only the exchange of gases takes place in alveoli. It is the end part of respiratory system. Okay. So alveoli will form the respiratory surface of the lungs. So oxygen will enter into the thin walls of alveoli. And where this oxygen will enter? It will enter into blood. That is, from alveoli, the oxygen will enter into blood. So here you can see the microscopic structure of alveoli, which are rich in surrounded by blood vessels. So which are surrounded by rich blood vessels. So that the oxygen will enter into the blood, and whatever the carbon dioxide present in the blood, it will reach to alveoli. So here the exchange of gases means whatever oxygen present in alveoli, it enters into blood. Whatever carbon dioxide blood present in the blood, it enters into alveoli. Okay. So where we can see the exchange part. Whereas the part starting from external nostrils up to bronchioles, it is nothing but conducting part. Whereas alveoli is exchange part. So it is actual diffusion of oxygen and CO2 between blood and atmospheric air takes place in alveoli. Okay. And where these alveoli are present, they are present inside the lungs. Lungs are present inside the thoracic chamber, which is dorsally formed by vertebral column, ventrally which has a triangular shaped bone sternum, and laterally by ribs, and lower side it has diaphragm. Okay. And when you come to after the structure of respiratory system, the next is, that is, the various stages of respiration. The first one is breathing or pulmonary ventilation. Next, diffusion of gases across alveolar membrane. Transport of gases by blood. And there is exchange of gases between the blood and tissues. So tissues will utilize oxygen and release CO2. Okay. So in breathing, there are two stages. So one is inspiration and another one is expiration. Okay. So your inspiration means taking in of oxygen. Expiration means sending out of carbon dioxide. So the physical process where carbon dioxide is sent out, it is expiration, where the physical process where oxygen is taken. Okay. So there is a movement of air into and out of the lungs, which is affected by pressure gradient between lungs and atmosphere. Okay. So here there is a pressure gradient between lungs and atmosphere. Okay, inspiration occurs when intrapulmonary pressure, that means the pulmonary pressure inside the lungs. So this pressure is inside the lungs, so which is lesser than atmospheric pressure. Whereas expiration is, it takes place when intrapulmonary pressure is higher than the atmospheric pressure. So depending upon the pressure gradient, we can see inspiration and expiration. Okay. To carry out this inspiration and expiration, So various parts are involved, like diaphragm, external and internal costal muscles, which will help in generation of such gradients. Okay. That is, to inspiration, for the process of inspiration, what happens? That is contraction of diaphragm. Due to contraction of diaphragm, what happens is the volume of thoracic chamber will increase. So the volume of thoracic chamber will increase. And next is contraction of intercostal muscles, which will lift the ribs and sternum, which will increase the volume of thoracic chamber. Dorsoventral axis. So overall increase in volume. So due to contraction of diaphragm, contraction of intercostal muscles, there is an increase in volume. As volume increases, okay, that is the pulmonary volume, the lungs volume will increase. As lungs volume will increase, the pressure inside the lungs, that is intrapulmonary pressure, will decrease. So volume is indirectly proportional to pressure. So volume is indirectly proportional to pressure. As volume increases, the pressure decreases. That is, as the thoracic volume increases, the intrapulmonary pressure will decrease. So due to this, what happens? Air will move into the lungs, that is the respiration. Inspiration. These are the changes which takes place during inspiration. And next, when we come to expiration. So what happens in expiration? So in expiration, so there is a relaxation of diaphragm and intercostal muscles, which is quite opposite to inspiration. Okay. That is, due to relaxation of this diaphragm and intercostal muscles, the diaphragm and sternum come to their normal position. Due to this, what happens? Reduction in thoracic volume takes place. Obviously, the pulmonary volume will decrease. So as volume decreases, there is increase in intrapulmonary pressure. So which leads to expulsion of air from lungs, so which is called expiration. So here this, on an average, healthy human breathes for 12 to 16 times per minute. So breathing means it includes inspiration and expiration. So where on an average 12 to 16 times per minute. Okay. So here you can see, in inhalation, that is inspiration, the diaphragm contracts, moves down. The diaphragm will move down in this direction. The intercostal muscles will contract, so that what happens is the rib cage will expand. So the intrapulmonary pressure decreases, so that air enters into the lungs. Whereas here it is quite opposite. The diaphragm relaxes, comes to normal position, and intercostal muscles relaxes, so that intrapulmonary pressure increases than atmosphere. It is higher than, so air is exhaled out. Okay. So till now we have discussed about the respiratory system, the inspiration and expiration. So now we are going to discuss about respiratory volumes. So there are various respiratory volumes like tidal volume, which is commonly called short in TD. Inspiratory reserve volume, IRV. Expiratory reserve volume, ERV. Residual volume, RV. So what is meant by tidal volume? So tidal volume means the volume of air are inspired during normal breath. It is roughly about 500 ml of air. Whereas when you come to inspiratory reserve volume, that is IRV, it is extra volume of air that can be inspired over the normal. That is, it roughly comes about 2500 to 3000 ml. Expiratory reserve volume, it is the maximum extra volume of air that can be sent out by forceful expiration. That is about 1000 to 1100 ml. Residual volume, it is the volume of air remains in the lungs after forceful expiration. It will be 1100 to 1200 ml. Okay. So here we are next after the lungs, that is the volume, next is lungs capacity. Here there are few equations which we should know about. That is, the inspiratory capacity is equals with tidal volume and inspiratory reserve volume. That means IC is equal to IRV plus TV, tidal volume. Such like functional residual capacity, that is FRC, is equal to expiratory reserve volume plus residual volume. The vital capacity is equal to inspiratory reserve volume plus tidal volume plus expiratory reserve volume. That is IRV plus tidal volume plus ERV. The total lung capacity is the maximum volume in which the lungs can be expanded to greatest possible. So it is equal to the vital capacity plus residual volume. So the total lung capacity, that is TLC, is equal to vital capacity plus residual volume. So here you can see the normal values, like tidal volume, that is normal values are 500, inspiratory reserve volume 3000 ml, expiratory reserve volume 1100, residual volume RV 1200, inspiratory capacity 3500, functional residual capacity 2300, vital capacity 4600, total lung capacity 5800 ml. These are normal values of a healthy young adult man. Okay. So here when you come to exchange of gases, so the primary site for exchange of gases is alveoli. And exchange of gases takes place between blood and tissues also. That is, whatever CO2 is released from the tissues, it will enter into blood and blood will give oxygen. So exchange of gases in these takes place by simple diffusion based on concentration gradient. Okay. So simple diffusion, it is affected by solubility of gases and thickness of the membrane, which will affect the rate of diffusion. Okay. For example, if you take solubility of CO2, it is 20 to 25 times higher than oxygen. That means carbon dioxide has more solubility than oxygen. That's the reason why the CO2 that can diffuse through diffusion membrane is higher when compared to oxygen. Okay. And when you come to diffusion membrane, that is the membrane of alveoli and the blood vessel, it has three layers. It is squamous epithelium, endothelium of alveolar capillaries, and basement membrane. And if you see the thickness of the entire these three layers, it is less than a millimeter. So all these factors are favorable for diffusion of O2 and CO2 from tissue to alveoli, O2 from alveoli to tissue. So here you can see the gas exchange takes place in alveoli, where if you observe this, PO2 means partial pressure of oxygen. So in alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen is higher than partial pressure of carbon dioxide. It is 104 mm per Hg, where PCO2 value is 40 mm per Hg. So that's the reason why the oxygen will enter into play. Okay. And when you come to the blood vessel which carries oxygenated blood, that is systemic arteries, where partial pressure of oxygen is 95 mm per Hg and PCO2 is 40 mm per Hg. Okay. And the blood vessel which carries deoxygenated blood, that is systemic veins, where partial pressure of oxygen is 40 and partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 45 mm per Hg. Okay. So like this, we can see exchange of gases in alveoli as well as tissues and the blood. Okay. So between alveoli and blood and tissues and blood. Okay. Finally, the blood reaches, that is the oxygen or whatever it is, it reaches to the blood. So this blood should be reaching to particular part. Okay. Like if you take in lungs, so blood will pick up O2. Okay. So blood will pick up O2 and drops of CO2 into the alveoli. Whereas in tissues, cells will pick up O2 and drop off CO2. So gases diffuse down pressure gradients in the lungs and tissues. So how these gases are carried in the blood, we'll see. That is the transportation of oxygen and transportation of the what we call carbon dioxide. Okay. So here when you come to blood, transport gases between lungs and body tissues. So when O2 and CO2 enter the blood, certain chemical reactions will help in transport and exchange of gases. So we'll see first oxygen transport. Okay. Oxygen doesn't dissolve easily in water. So that's the reason why only 1.5% of inhaled oxygen is dissolved in blood plasma, which is mostly in water. So what about remaining 98.5%? This 98.5% of O2 is bound with hemoglobin. So the red colored pigment which is present in red blood cells. Hemoglobin has heme portion, that is, which is nothing but iron, which has 4 atoms of iron. As it has 4 atoms of iron, it is capable of binding to a molecule of O2. That is, each one is capable of binding O2. Okay. So a hemoglobin can carry 4 O2 molecules. Okay. So here you can see oxygen and hemoglobin. Hemoglobin combines with oxygen and forms oxyhemoglobin. So 98.5% of oxygen is carried out through hemoglobin, which is trapped inside our BC. So only 1.5%, very less percentage of oxygen, that is 1.5, through plasma. So very less percentage is transferred through plasma. And it is a reversible one where depending upon the tissues or the location, it will be reversible. Okay. Here you can see the dissociation of oxygen from hemoglobin depends on partial pressure of oxygen. So the higher the partial pressure of oxygen, the more O2 combines with hemoglobin. And it depends on acidity. As pH decreases, the affinity for O2 decreases. Even temperature increases, oxygen readily dissociates. If partial pressure of carbon dioxide is more than partial pressure of oxygen, we can see dissociation. Okay. So PCO2, pH, acidity, these all factors PCO2 will affect the binding and dissociation of oxygen to hemoglobin. Okay. To explain this oxygen dissociation, there is the oxygen dissociation curve. That is when we plot the percentage saturation of hemoglobin against partial pressure of oxygen. So it is called oxygen dissociation curve, where we will get sigmoid curve. So it shows that the partial pressure of O2 increases, the ability of HB combining with the O2 will increase and reaches to maximum. After this level, even if there is an increase in partial pressure of oxygen, there is no increase. So in this picture we can see. So partial pressure of oxygen, okay, percentage of saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. So here it has come to saturation point here, a sigmoid curve. After this, there is no, even though the partial pressure of oxygen increases, there is no increase in this. This is called oxygen dissociation curve. So this oxygen dissociation curve is sigmoid shaped. Sigmoid shaped means S shape. So till now we have discussed about, that is, the transport of oxygen. Follow us SPSVERSITY on social media. Now we will discuss about the transport of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is transported in three forms. It is, whereas oxygen is transported only in two forms. One is only 1%, 1.5% through plasma, 98.5% through. So here if you take this CO2 which is transported in three forms, that is dissolved carbon dioxide. So the smallest percentage, 7%, is dissolved in plasma. On reaching to lungs, it will diffuses, it is exhaled. Carbaminohemoglobin, where about 23% combines with the amino group of hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin. And the main CO2 binding sites, that is, the hemoglobin combines with that is 2 alpha, that is, when you take the hemoglobin, it has 2 alpha and 2 beta chains. So hemoglobin binds with and form carbaminohemoglobin, which is only of 23%. Okay. And 70%, the maximum percent, is in the form of bicarbonate ions. So most of the CO2, that is 70%, is transported in the form of bicarbonate ions. As CO2 diffuses into capillaries and enters into red blood cells, it reacts with water in the presence of enzyme carbonic anhydrase. That is, initially carbon dioxide combines with water in the presence of an enzyme carbonic anhydrase and forms carbonic acid H2CO3. This H2CO3 splits into H plus and HCO3 minus. So in this form, the carbon dioxide is transported in three forms. One is through plasma, that is 7%, through carbamino hemoglobin form, which is of 23%, bicarbonate ion, which is of 70%. So thus a blood picks up, that is CO2, that is bicarbonate ions, which will accumulate inside orbits. Okay. So some bicarbonate ions move out of the blood plasma in exchange of chloride ions. So the net effect of these reactions is CO2 is removed from tissues and transported in the blood plasma. So that blood passes through pulmonary capillaries, the reactions are reversed and CO2 is exhaled. So it is a reversible reaction, where again carbonic acid is formed, again it is split into carbon dioxide and water. Okay. So here most of the CO2 is transported in the form of bicarbonate ions. So here you can see CO2 is released from tissues, so which enters into orbits. So it combines with water, forms carbonic acid, splits into bicarbonate and H+. Okay. So hemoglobin picks up CO2 and H+. So comes to lungs. Here comes to, this is lungs, where it is reversible reaction, where HCO3 and H+ combine with H2 and again splits into H2O and CO2. CO2 enters into alveoli. So CO2 enters into finally alveoli. So this is how the transport of carbon dioxide takes place in three forms. One is through plasma, another through carbamino hemoglobin, and most of the percentage, that is bicarbonate ions. Okay. So till now we have discussed about the structure of respiratory system, the inspiration, expiration, and next, that is the transport of oxygen and transport of carbon dioxide. So this respiration which takes place, how it is regulated. So the regulation of respiration has two control mechanisms. One is nervous and another one is chemical. So the center which is present in medulla and pons, it consists of dorsal respiratory, so which is dorsal portion of medulla. It gets activated when CO2 concentration is high, so which will cause inspiration. And in medulla there is ventral respiratory group, which causes inspiration or expiration. And there is a pneumotaxic center in the pons, which will limits inspiration. So there is a dorsal respiratory group, ventral respiratory group, and pneumotaxic center. Till now what we discussed is about nervous, now chemical. So chemoreceptors which are present in carotid and aortic bodies, they will detect the changes. That is, the excess of CO2 and H+ stimulate the respiratory center and accordingly alter inspiratory activities and expiratory signals to the respiratory muscles to regulate ventilation of lungs. Okay. So when you come to disorders of respiratory system, there are various disorders like asthma, bronchitis. So asthma means severe allergic reaction, which will cause contraction of bronchioles, making breathing difficult. Bronchitis, where it is inflammation of lining of bronchial tubules. So due to inflammation, what happens is the pathway becomes swollen and it is clogged with mucus, where it becomes difficulty. Breathing will become difficult. And there is another one, that is emphysema. So emphysema means where lungs lose their elasticity. So deterioration of lung structure. So pneumonia, which is caused by bacterial or viral infection, where alveoli get filled with fluid. And there is lung cancer, where there are tumors are formed inside the lungs. So tumors are formed inside. So beside asthma, bronchitis, lung cancer, emphysema, there are occupational lung diseases. What is this occupational lung disease? So depending upon the workplace, there are a group of occupational diseases. Like, depending upon the workplace, the particles which are released in the workplace, they are inspired, which will enter into alveoli. So there are common examples like silicosis, where the people working in quarrying, granite, sandstone, stand masonry, blasting and pottery work, where they are exposed to silicone compounds for long term. So where it leads to predisposition to the development of tuberculosis. And there is asbestosis, which is caused by inhaling asbestos fibers. Usually develops for 10 to 20 years exposure, but sometimes it may be only for 2 years. So the people who are working in asbestos mines, making products or at least, there are different types. Blue asbestosis, which is very serious disease. Like occupational disorders like asbestosis, silicosis, these all are serious. So till now we have discussed about the structure of respiratory system, human respiratory system, the process, the inspiration, expiration, the transport of gases O2 and CO2, and next, that is, we have discussed about the regulation of respiration, and next we discussed about, that is, the disorders of respiratory system. So that's all for today's session. Let us meet in the next session. Follow us on SPSVERSITY. Thank you all.